The man governed Kaduna State for 8 years. He commanded billions in federal allocations. He had the ears of presidents. He built roads, demolished churches and mosques, fired thousands of teachers, and survived assassination attempts. And then, voluntarily, he walked into a government building and handed himself over. Not arrested, not dragged in, walked in. Now here's the question nobody is asking loudly enough. Why would one of Nigeria's most calculating politicians, a man who has outmaneuvered opponents his entire career, voluntarily surrender to a process he could have avoided or delayed for years? Was it confidence? Was it a trap? Or did Nasir Ahmad El-Rufai just make the biggest miscalculation of his political life? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the answer is going to surprise you. Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Naija News feed, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics without the noise, without the spin. Hit subscribe and stay with me because this one gets interesting. Let's lay the foundation quickly because context is everything here. Nasir El-Rufai served as governor of Kaduna State from 2015 to 2023, 2 full terms under the APC umbrella. Before that, he was FCT minister under Obasanjo, and he's been one of the most prominent voices in Nigerian opposition and reformist politics for over 2 decades. After leaving office in 2023, El-Rufai did something unusual for a former Nigerian governor. He didn't go quiet. He became increasingly vocal against the Tinubu administration, making comments about the economy, governance failures, and what he called the betrayal of the progressive movement that brought APC to power in 2015. Then came the Kaduna State House of Assembly. The state legislature, now largely aligned with interests opposed to El-Rufai, moved to investigate allegations against him relating to his time in office. The claims range from financial misconduct to abuse of power. And here is the trigger moment. Rather than take the route many Nigerian politicians take, filing court injunctions, seeking international travel to attend medical appointments, or simply going silent, El-Rufai publicly announced he would appear before the panel. He called it a test of the rule of law. His critics called it a trap he walked into with his eyes open, and some of his own allies called it, in their words, his greatest mistake. The question is, which of them is right? And here's what makes this genuinely unusual. In a country where politicians routinely use the courts to block any investigation for years, El-Rufai chose the opposite move. That tells you something. We just need to figure out what. Now, let's look at the structure, because understanding the institutions involved tells you a lot about what's really at stake. The Kaduna State House of Assembly has constitutional powers under Sections 128 and 129 of the 1999 Constitution to investigate the executive arm of government and any person or institution receiving public funds. This is a standard oversight function. It exists in every state. However, and this is critical, a State House of Assembly cannot prosecute. They can investigate, make findings, and recommend. If they want criminal charges, they must refer to the EFCC, ICPC, or the Attorney General's office. So what exactly does appearing before this panel expose El-Rufai to? Firstly, anything he says on record before that panel can be used as evidence in a subsequent criminal or civil proceeding. That's a real legal risk, and it's the reason most lawyers advise their clients to invoke their rights and stay silent. Secondly, the panel's findings, even if not legally binding, carry enormous political and reputational weight. A damning report becomes ammunition for future prosecutions and, more importantly, shapes public perception ahead of any 2027 political calculation. Thirdly, there's the question of immunity. El-Rufai's immunity as governor expired when he left office in May 2023. He is now a private citizen, legally exposed in ways he simply was not 2 years ago. The gray area here, and it's a big one, is the question of independence. Is this House of Assembly acting as a genuine...
Now we get to the real heart of it, because nothing happening here is accidental. Let's start with who benefits. Governor Uba Sani, who succeeded El-Rufai in Kaduna, has had a complicated relationship with his predecessor. El-Rufai publicly supported Uba Sani's emergence, but political loyalties in Nigeria have a short shelf life. The Kaduna political space is now largely under Uba Sani's control, and the House of Assembly reflects that reality. Then there's the Tinubu factor. El-Rufai has been one of the most prominent critics of the Tinubu administration from within the progressive space. He's questioned the removal of fuel subsidies implementation, raised alarms about the state of the economy, and reportedly turned down a ministerial appointment. In Nigerian politics, that kind of independence from someone who knows where bodies are buried makes you a target. Here's a critical question. Is the Abuja political establishment comfortable with El-Rufai being free, vocal, and potentially organizing ahead of 2027? The answer is almost certainly no. Now, let's look at what El-Rufai was thinking. His decision to appear before the panel wasn't naive, or at least it wasn't meant to be naive. His public reasoning was essentially, if I run, I look guilty. If I fight this in court for years, I look guilty and I'm sidelined. But if I appear, answer the questions and demonstrate that there's nothing to hide, I come out looking like the most principled man in Nigerian politics. That's a legitimate strategic calculation, in theory. The problem, and his allies who called it his greatest mistake understand this, is that Nigerian institutional processes are rarely neutral. When a panel is constituted by people who are aligned with your political opponents, showing up and cooperating doesn't guarantee a fair hearing. It can mean you've handed your opponents a platform, a record, and a process they control. Here's a historical comparison that should chill you. In 2015, many of the same arguments about showing up and clearing your name were made about politicians who then found themselves on the receiving end of selective prosecution. Cooperation in Nigerian politics is sometimes treated not as evidence of innocence, but an invitation to dig deeper. The silent players. Don't ignore what's happening in the background. There are at least 3 categories of people watching this closely and not making noise. 1. APC national leadership, who need to decide whether El-Rufai is a manageable critic or an existential threat to their 2027 narrative. 2. Opposition figures in the PDP and Labour parties, who would love nothing more than to see the progressive coalition fracture further over this. 3. Northern political elites, particularly those who view El-Rufai as either a rival or an embarrassment to the region's political interests. His education reform, the mass teacher sackings, and his handling of the farmer herder crisis in Kaduna made him enemies across ethnic and religious lines in his own base. The timeline of moves so far. El-Rufai leaves office May 2023. Becomes increasingly critical of the Tinubu administration through late 2023 and 2024. Kaduna Hosa investigation announced. El-Rufai publicly declares he will appear, framing it as support for the rule of law. Allies privately express concern. National political media runs with the narrative of greatest mistake. Each move is deliberate, and the next moves will be equally deliberate on all sides. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. The 2027 dimension. This is perhaps the underreported angle. El-Rufai has not hidden his political ambitions. There has been persistent speculation about his interest in a presidential run in 2027, or at minimum, his desire to remain a kingmaker in northern politics. An investigation that produces damning findings, even if never prosecuted, is the kind of thing that follows a politician into every press conference, every campaign rally, every endorsement conversation. And the people who want to stop him from playing that role in 2027 know exactly how this game works. There's a specific document that emerged from El-Rufai's time as governor that legal analysts say could be the real reason his opponents wanted him in that room. I'll tell you exactly what it is before this video ends. Let's zoom out. What does this mean for Nigeria beyond Kaduna State? Federal-state dynamics. One of the defining tensions of Nigerian federalism is the question of accountability after office. Very few Nigerian governors face meaningful scrutiny after their tenure. If the Kaduna Hossa process leads to any real consequence for El-Rufai, even a referral to the EFCE, it would mark a shift in the political culture. Whether that shift is genuine accountability or selective justice is a different conversation. For ordinary Nigerians, the framing matters. If it's seen as political victimization, it reinforces the deeply held belief that the law in Nigeria is a weapon, not a standard. If it's seen as accountability, it might begin to shift expectations of what happens to governors after they leave office. The economic dimension. Kaduna State under El-Rufai was a significant recipient of World Bank loans for infrastructure and social programs. If investigations touch on how those funds were administered, there are implications not just for El-Rufai personally, but for Nigeria's relationships with multilateral lenders who have flagged governance concerns. Security implications. El-Rufai's tenure in Kaduna was defined in part by the farmer-herder crisis, one of the most deadly subnational conflicts in Africa during that period. His approach to that crisis remains deeply controversial. If the investigation reopens those wounds, particularly among communities in southern Kaduna, the process itself could inflame existing tensions regardless of its legal outcome. And this is where it connects to something much bigger than Kaduna, because the international story of this story is one most Nigerian commentators are ignoring entirely.
There is a genuine international dimension here, so this section stays in. El-Rufai has historically had significant relationships with Western governments and multilateral institutions. During his time as FCT minister and later as governor, he cultivated a profile as a technocratic reformer, the kind of Nigerian politician that Western development institutions liked to point to as evidence that reformist governance was possible. That profile gave him access and credibility abroad that most Nigerian politicians don't have. The UK and US governments have both, in recent years, used visa restrictions and financial sanctions as tools against Nigerian officials accused of corruption or undermining democratic processes. There is at least the theoretical possibility that if findings against El-Rufai reach a certain threshold, it could trigger conversations in foreign capitals. More immediately relevant, El-Rufai has reportedly maintained relationships with members of the Nigerian diaspora, particularly in the UK and North America, who form part of the progressive political base he would need for any future national political project. What diaspora Nigerians should understand is this: what's being decided in Kaduna right now is partly a test of whether Nigerian institutions can hold powerful people accountable without political motivation distorting the process. If the answer is no, which is what most Nigerians already believe, the implications for democratic credibility go well beyond one man's political career. Let's address what people are getting wrong, because there's a lot of noise around this story. Misconception 1. El-Rufai is being persecuted because he criticized Tinubu. This is probably the most popular narrative among his supporters, and there may be truth in it, but it flattens a more complicated picture. El-Rufai is not a saint who suddenly attracted political enemies by speaking truth to power. He made enemies long before he criticized Tinubu, through his education reforms, his handling of the 2016 Southern Kaduna killings, and a governing style that many described as high-handed. The political motivation behind this investigation doesn't automatically mean the substance of the allegations is false. Misconception 2. Appearing before the panel was obviously the right thing to do. It shows courage. His supporters are framing this as a principled stand, and on one level it is. But let's be precise. Courage in a system where institutions are genuinely fair is a virtue. Cooperation in a system where the process is controlled by your opponents is something closer to strategic recklessness. The question is not whether he should cooperate with accountability. The question is whether this particular process is a legitimate accountability mechanism or a political operation dressed in constitutional clothing. Misconception 3. This is about justice for Kaduna people. Some voices are framing this as ordinary Kaduna citizens finally getting answers about how their state was governed. That framing has legitimacy. Kaduna people deserve accountability, but the timing, the actors involved, and the political context make it very difficult to take that framing at face value. Genuine accountability processes don't tend to be announced in the middle of escalating political feuds. The strongest counter-argument from El-Rufai's critics. His 8-year record includes serious, documented controversies, from the handling of the 2016 Southern Kaduna killings to questions about infrastructure contracts. These are not invented by political opponents. They deserve honest investigation. And if El-Rufai truly has nothing to hide, then a properly constituted independent process should not be something he fears. Where that argument falls apart is the word independent. That's the variable that changes everything. There's been a pattern in Nigerian politics, 3 times in the last decade, where a politician cooperated with an investigation. The findings were used not for prosecution, but for political leverage. I'll connect that pattern to this situation right now. In 2014, in 2019, and again in 2022, high-profile figures who chose engagement over legal resistance found their testimony and voluntary disclosures weaponized, not in courts, but in press conferences, in party meetings, and in the backroom negotiations of candidate selection. The goal was never necessarily conviction. It was leverage, control, the ability to say, "We have what you said on record. Now, what are you willing to do?" That is the game El-Rufai may have walked into.
What happens next? Here's my honest assessment. Most likely scenario. The panel produces findings, some critical, some muted. The findings are referred to the EFCC or the State Attorney General. The EFCC opens a file. El-Rufai's lawyers file court processes to challenge the legality of the investigation. Everything slows to a crawl. By mid-2026, it's in judicial limbo, which is exactly where Nigerian political cases go to die, or to be resurrected at convenient moments. Watch for these signals. If the EFCC moves with unusual